Hello everybody, my name's Nick and I'm here to talk to you today about Reaper. So before we get much further into this, what is Reaper? Reaper is what is known as a digital audio workstation, also known as DAW. And DAWs are used to work with sound, whether that's processing WAV files, writing out MIDI, any kind of audio editing can be done in a DAW. It's a very useful tool. So first thing we're going to do is install Reaper. So if you type in Reaper and Google it, should be the first thing that comes up. It's got their flashy web page. You go to the download link and you pick up the version respective to your operating system. So once you get that installed, if you tell it to pop up on your desktop, it will do just that. So let's double click this. And this is what you will see the first time you open Reaper. So before we get too much further into this, I'd like to ask you guys all to go and check out one thing real quick. So Reaper's default menu system is pretty messy and I wouldn't really recommend it. So if you Google remenus and go to the first link, you will find a list on how to get that installed. If you just follow through the instructions right here, you will get that done. And what that does is rearrange the menus up at the top to be much better organized, and it will be congruent to what you see on my screen, so I'd recommend doing that, although I'll try to talk through where things are by default as well. Alright, so now all that's out of the way, let's take a look. So there's three kind of major sections we're looking at right now. This little spot over here, this guy down here, and the big editing section over here. So let's start with the left, because until we put anything there, nothing's going to happen. So when you double click, boom, a track appears. So what is a track? A track basically holds sound. You can put a WAV file in it, you could load a virtual instrument into it. It's basically a way for you to organize your project and sort your sounds out. So right now it's totally empty. Let's put something in it real quick. I'm just gonna find a random sound file off of my computer. Back. Let's grab an MP3. Real quick. Here we are. Let's just take some white noise. So, we play that. White noise, very unpleasant. So, first thing you'll notice is that was pretty loud. So, let's take a look at this little slider here. This is the volume of the track. You can see when I put the mouse over it, it says 0 decibels, which is what every track is set to by default. So that was really loud, so we're going to turn that down a bit just by dragging. The cool thing to note about Reaper is if you double click on any of these knobs, it'll restore them to the default. So let's turn that down, play it again. This is the transform down here. You can use it to play, stop, rewind, fast forward, and pause tracks. And before I get any further into that, you notice that I dragged the white noise into this section over here. This is the editing section. This is where you will see your sound files that you stick in there, or your MIDI tracks under your tracks. So you've got your tracks here, and what is contained in the track you will see to the right in the editing section. And when I scroll the mouse wheel, it zooms it in and out, pretty useful. So this block right here is the MP3 file that is our white noise. I can click it and drag it around. When I go to the far left and right, you see this little logo come up. And you can use that to cut off both ends of the track, and if I extend it beyond its natural length, there's not really anything there. So if you click on a track and hit delete, it'll go away. So let's shrink that back down. Alright, so let's go back to the track for a second and take a look at some of these knobs and what they do. So see this guy over here? Restore the track back to the beginning. Press play. Right there, that is giving us an output on how loud the track is. So you see it's at -7.6 decibels. So earlier there was a little orange tab there. It's still there in the master. Let me clear that. And that tells you that your track is clipping. So let's turn this back up. And you see it's plus 1.5 decibels. Anything above 0 decibels is clipping, and you don't want that, because when a track is clipping, it is louder than Reaper can handle, and you'll get distortion, and it just sounds really bad. So that little orange is just a little notification to remind you that it is clipping. You can click on that to get rid of it. And we turn down the track, play it again. Then -6 decibels, not clipping, much better. Alright, so let's get rid of this white noise. And if you, when I drag in a sound file, it automatically names this track, whatever the sound file is. If you double click on it, you can name it whatever you want. I would highly recommend you name your tracks, because it starts to get pretty confusing when you put a bunch of stuff there. And I'm going to double click again, add another track real quick. Just to illustrate some points, you can move tracks around by clicking the number and dragging them. It helps for organizing. And you can also parent tracks to one another. There's a whole folder system. That's useful if you're wanting to just categorize stuff if you start getting really big files. Alright, so to delete a track, you just click on it, hit delete, it's gone. Alright, so let's put something other than white noise in there. Let me take a song I did. Whoa, not that one. That's a MIDI file. Let's do an MP3. Right. So, let's take a look at some of these other knobs. So let's look at this guy here. This is the pan of the track. What that is if you're wearing headphones or if you have two speakers, it will determine how far to the left or right the track is. So if you're wearing headphones right now, you'll be able to hear this. I'm going to turn this all the way to the left and play. You should only be hearing it in your left ear. Now you notice as I drag it, you can hear it in both ears, and then only in your right ear. Panning is useful later on when you start mixing tracks to help space things out better, but for the time being, it's just a useful tool to know. So, let's add another track and put in a bunch of other stuff so I can illustrate some points here. Alright, so now we've got multiple tracks. You can see they've all got their MP3 stuff. I played it all at the same time. This is the second biggest planet besides. It's kind of noisy. So, that's where these little buttons come into play. The M and the S. The M stands for mute. Pretty self-explanatory. When I mute tracks, you just don't hear them. You see, we're not getting any output. Another way to do this is if you solo a track, you will only hear the tracks that are soloed. You can solo more than one track. And you can do any kind of crazy combination of soloing and muting. It's useful when you've got a more complete song and you're trying to hear an individual track, or if you just want to hear what a mix sounds like without your drums, any kind of situation. It's very useful to know. Alright, so let's delete some of these. And before we go any further, I'll talk about this down here real quick. Kind of skipped over it. This is just an alternate view of all of your tracks. You notice every time I add one, it appears down there. And when I move a dial down here, it moves up here as well, and vice versa. This is useful for another view, and since it kind of gets messy up here, if you got a ton of tracks, it's easier to see down here. That's useful, like, when you're further along in like an audio project or a song, you've got like 20 tracks, and you want to mix them all in volume balance and stuff without having to scroll up and down. Alright, so let's delete these guys. And let's take a look at this FX button. I just went ahead and clicked it. So this is where you can add plugins to a track. This includes virtual instruments like pianos, synthesizers, effects like reverb, compression, what have you. So right now this track is empty. Kind of boring. So let's click FX and these two windows should pop up. If you get just this window here, if you click add or double click in the white section, this other window will pop up. So let's take a look at these two windows. This is the list of plugins you have currently active on the track. There's nothing there right now, so it's empty. And this is where you select plugins to add to said track. So we're going to go to VST, and you'll notice I've got a lot of stuff. And when you open this for the first time, you should have three things. These guys right here. So let's take a look at Resynth. This is the synthesizer that comes built into Reaper. Very simple. You're not going to get much more than like chiptune-esque sounds out of this, but it's a good place to start. So let's double click, and boom. You see the synthesizer on the left over here, and a bunch of settings on the right over here. A lot of virtual instruments work this way, where when you have them selected, they'll have a bunch of knobs and parameters show up, and you can mess around with them. Alright, so as of right now, this isn't going to do anything. If I play it, you don't hear anything. That's because we haven't told the synthesizer to do anything yet. So, how we're going to do that is we go to this editing area. If you've installed Remenus and right click, you can go to Insert and then MIDI Item, and a little MIDI item pops up. If you do not have that and you're using the default Reaper menus, there should be an Insert menu up here, and I believe at the top or bottom there will be a MIDI item. Alright, so let's zoom in. And let's look at the top of this real quick before we go any further. So you see 1 1, 1 3, 2 1, 2 3. What that is, if you have any familiarity of music, that is the measure and the beat number. So measure 1, beat 1, measure 1, beat 2. We have a 4-beat measure, and then you go to measure 2. I won't get too much into that. That'll be for a future video, but it's useful for tracking where you are on the song. And at the bottom, you've got the amount of time in seconds. So half a second, 1 second, second and a half, 2 seconds, so on and so forth. Those are useful just for tracking where you are in the song. Alright. So let's double click on this MIDI item. And boom, we've got a whole new screen now. So if you are composing in Reaper, you will be spending a lot of time looking at this screen. So let's take a listen. That is the synthesizer we just set up. So, since this track has a synthesizer loaded into it, when we hit the keys, it's sending MIDI information to that synthesizer, which is then responding and giving us a sine wave. Alright, so that's all fine and dandy, but we need to put some of this down if we want Reaper to actually do anything when we hit the play button. So, you see all these little grids and squares here. What this is, if you look at the top of the screen, you see the same measure beat related information that we saw at the top of our editor. I won't go into too much detail on that for now, but if you click once and drag, you can put down a MIDI note. So, we're going to just do 4 of those. So, if you click once and drag, note appears. You can move left and right to increase and decrease it once it's down. Very similar to editing MIDI items and MP3s in the editor. You can click on the left and right to change its length in that direction. If you double click it, it'll disappear. Also, if you don't want to drag, you can just double click and a note will appear. And if you right click and move around, you can create a block and select multiple notes and move them all around. Very useful. And also, if you click and hit delete, you can delete it. Control Z to get that back. You can also delete things in a group if you so desire. Hit Control Z again because we want that back. Alright. One last thing. You notice, as I'm moving this up and down, the volume's changing. That's because the MIDI notes hold the velocity of the note, which is just a fancy word for the volume. So by clicking on the line, getting this little logo here, you can move it up and down and change the volume of the note. Now, some virtual instruments don't listen to that, some do. Resynth does, so it is affected by that. So let's hit play. Alright, so this MIDI information is being sent through Resynth, and we are getting the sound of a sine wave playing those notes. So I'm going to hit this loop button down here. What that does is when I hit play, it keeps playing it over and over again until I tell it to stop. This is very useful for when you're like tweaking your mix or messing around with the synthesizer. Alright, so let's turn some of these knobs and see what happens. volume is pretty self-explanatory. So tuning, that will adjust the actual note values by sense. So very small, you'll hear it start to go flat. So eventually you just hit different notes, and when you get to negative 1200 cents, that's on a whole nother octave. Yeah, we'll talk about that at another time. So, let's look at the attack, decay, sustain, and release. I will go into more detail on this later if I talk about synthesizers, but these are basically parameters that affect the sound of the synthesizer. I'm just going to move them around. Now it sounds totally different. So you can do all kinds of crazy stuff with that. At the bottom of here, you can mess around with the wave shape. Let's get some different sounds. We're not going to go into too much detail on that because synthesizers and sound design is another video entirely, but you can mess around with virtual instruments. Alright, so let's restore this to the default. A lot of virtual instruments have defaults and presets up here that you can find. Resynth doesn't really have any, but we can restore that to default. Alright, so let's do some processing on this. One of the powerful things about DAWs is, in addition to instruments, you can apply effects to them. Once again, you open the FX, pretend none of this is there, click there, double click here, and your list comes back up. So I'm going to talk real quick about the difference between VSTI and VST. So VSTI are your virtual instruments. So this would be synthesizers. If you have like a piano or a string instrument, all of that will appear here. You'll get the names. Some of these are just nothing, but you can see there names of instruments: piano, strings, synth. You get the idea. You go to the VST, that's where you get effects. That's where you get stuff like reverb, EQ. I'll go into what some of those are very, very, very briefly. For the time being, we're just going to do reverb since that is the simplest. So you should have a number of built-in Reaper stuff already there, and some of these tools that come with Reaper are so useful that I still use them even though I have professional software. So let's take a look at reverb, something you're going to want to use in pretty much any mix. So double click, and you get another little guy here on the left, and once again you get some loaded settings here. So if you play this, you're not going to hear anything. So that is because in reverb you need to give it some impulses, and what those will do is generate an echoey sound. That's essentially what reverb is. It makes stuff sound like it's in a room, it's reverberating, it's bouncing around. So just to keep this simple, we're going to go up to the top in the presets again and just do Sweet Verbo. This is just some very basic reverb. You got a little bit of reverb, a little bit of echo. You can go around and mess around with those if you want to see what they do, but for now, let's just play it. So you notice after the note stops, it carries on for a little bit. It sounds very echoey. It's actually a little bit too high right now. So we have our wet knob and our dry knob. What the wet does is it is the effect that your reverb is putting out in its volume, and the dry is just the original track. So you'll notice if I turn wet all the way down, it sounds like nothing. And as I turn it up, it'll start bringing in some reverb. Sorry to headphone users if that hurt, but you can turn up the wet too loud, and this can increase the volume of your track, and it can make it clip. Again, I apologize if that hurt anyone's ears. Alright, so another cool thing you can do, you can remove the original track sound entirely and only play the processed sound. So if I remove the dry, you're only hearing the reverb on the track. It's a little bit harder to hear on a synthesizer, but the point remains. Let's add one more thing real quick so I can illustrate another point. Let's see. What do we want to put on here? Let's throw on some EQ. EQ is pretty important. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on what this does right now. That's for another video. But essentially this allows you to edit the volumes of different ranges in your sound. When you get down to like 0 hertz, that's really low. You can't even hear that. Most people can't hear below 20 hertz. Most people actually can't even hear any more than that. So 100 hertz is about the range like basses and kick drums occupy, from there to about 80. 1000 hertz is about the range of human voice to 3000 hertz, depending on the timbre of your voice. And once you start getting in the 10,000, 20,000 hertz, most people can't hear above 20,000 hertz. Most people actually can't hear above like 16,000, depending on how old you are. The whole point is you can use this to shape the sound. So I'm going to play this sine wave. You see that yellow line is showing you the frequency range that your track occupies. So if I move this EQ band downwards, it starts decreasing stuff in the 1000 hertz frequency range. You can mess around with the bandwidth to tell it how wide to be. You can mess around with the gain. You can decrease stuff or boost it. And you can move around the frequency. So we'll get into what this is useful for a little bit more detail later, but for now I just wanted to put multiple effects on this track to illustrate another point. So the ordering of these effects actually matters. So if I drag resynth all the way to the end, you don't hear the reverb or the EQ, and that's because resynth isn't being triggered until after the EQ and reverb are triggered, and you are not putting anything into this reverb or the EQ. They're not getting any signal, so nothing happens. So when I put resynth back up at the top, you suddenly hear them again. And it's a little bit hard to hear right now with the reverb and the EQ, but the order of your post-processing also matters. So this time it will adjust the equalization before going to reverb. So typically when you're mixing, you want your EQ to be the first thing that happens after your instrument, unless you're messing around with the pitch. And reverb's typically one of the latter things you're going to want to put on. To illustrate that better, let me just throw on some distortion real quick. Let's see, what do I want to use? Let's throw on some Camel Crusher. It's a good free tool for distortion, compression. Might want to look into downloading that. Anyway, so when I put this before the reverb, let's actually change our synthesizer to a square wave so we can hear that a bit better. You can hear the distortion coming on before the reverb. If I put it after the reverb, it's applying distortion to the reverb as well, which if you really want a grungy, dirty sound, you may want that, but this is a case where the ordering of your plugins definitely matters. Sorry about that, I had to stop recording for a bit. Anyway, that's basically all you need to know to get started in Reaper. The major roadblock I find for a lot of people is just amassing more virtual instruments. They don't really know where to start. So all you really need to do to get more is just go to Google. Let's say I want a cello. Cello VST. Boom. Free download. And you will find this for pretty much any instrument you can think of. There's lots of college students and like hobbyists out there who just make freeware VSTs and just release them for everybody to have. So if you just look around and start putting stuff on your computer, you will start to pick up some resources. So let me show you the process for getting something on there real quick. So MDA piano's a serviceable piano, but it's free and good place to start if you just want something other than a synthesizer. So if you Google MDA piano, go to the first link, and you got a bunch of stuff here. So these are all the different downloads. It's an important thing to note that PCs and Macs use different file extensions for virtual instruments. PCs will not run Mac virtual instruments, and Macs will not run PC virtual instruments. So make sure you download the right one. And if you're a Mac user, I'm sorry, but a lot of the freeware out there is developed just for Windows, since it's just like one-man projects. There's still stuff for Macs out there, especially with the bigger companies, but just a heads up that you may have a hard time finding good freeware for Macs, so sorry about that. Anyway, so when we're on this page, I'm on PC, so let's just go ahead and grab this. I'll slap it on my desktop real quick for demonstration purposes. Whoops. You weren't supposed to say that. So we open this up, and we have our DLL. So this is the file type that Windows uses, and you can see here it's just a DLL. Sometimes it'll ask you to install stuff. You know, just like anything, exercise caution. I've never gotten any malware or viruses from virtual instrument download, but sometimes, you know, when it says default versus advanced settings, you're going to want to click advanced because maybe it's trying to download another toolbar on Chrome. You know, just exercise caution. Anyway, so let's put this somewhere where Reaper knows to look for it. So just downloading virtual instruments isn't good enough. You gotta tell Reaper where to look for them and put it in a place you can find them. So you can see I've got a VST folder under my documents where I've just got a lot of stuff, and you can see I already have MDA piano in there, so let's pretend I dragged that in. And you can see the file extension for this is users nic documents VST. Now when I go to Reaper, if you click options, depending on whether or not you have menus, preferences will either be at the top or the bottom, I think. And if you scroll down on the left here to plugins and then VST, you have a list of paths. So you can see I've got a path for my VST folder, so Reaper knows to look there. You can also add stuff by navigating to it. There's my VST folder under all that other stuff. You get the idea. You just tell it to look, and in order to get it to pick up your new instruments, sometimes you have to go to FX, scan for new plugins, or you could restart Reaper, but scan for new plugins typically works a little better. And if it finds new stuff, you'll see a little new tab here showing you what it found, and if it's an effect, it'll slap it under VST. If it's an instrument, you'll find it under VSTI. One thing to note that causes a little bit of confusion: VSTs are used online to refer universally to both effects and instruments. So Reverb VST, Cello VST, it's all the same thing, but then when you download it in the Reaper, it'll separate it out. So just something to remember that can throw some people off. Alright, so that's about it for this video. I may go into some more complicated topics later on, but knowing this information will certainly be enough for you to start messing around, maybe find some other tutorials, and just explore and see what happens. Alright, thanks for watching, and goodbye.